Montana Territory, July 1882. The sun had barely cleared the mountaintops when the shrill cry of a child broke the stillness of the prairie. Naomi Thatcher knew that sound. Not a tantrum. Not a scraped knee. It was the kind of cry that came from being left behind. She pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill and stepped off the porch of the schoolhouse, her boots crunching over dry grass. The little boy stood near the hitching post, fists balled, face red, dust on his trousers. His sister, a few years older, sat on the edge of the watering trough, watching the dirt like it might swallow her whole. Naomi crouched beside them. "Where's your folks?" The boy hiccuped. "Gone." The girl looked up, her eyes too old for her small face. "They said they'd be back last night." "They're not coming back." Naomi's stomach dropped. "What are your names?" "I'm Addie," the girl said. "He's Amos." "All right," Naomi said gently. "Come with me." She took their hands, small and stiff with fear, and led them inside the schoolhouse. The classroom still smelled of chalk and ink, the long benches empty in the summer break. She gave them bread and jam, her own breakfast, then sat on the floor beside them. Addie ate like someone who did not trust food would be there tomorrow. Amos leaned against Naomi's arm, quiet now, crumbs on his chin. She would figure out what to do with them. But not right now. Right now they just needed to feel safe. The door creaked open behind her. She turned, expecting one of the ranch hands from the neighboring properties. Instead, it was him. Merritt Zane. He filled the doorway like he always had, tall, broad-shouldered, hat in one hand, dust on his collar. His hair was darker than she remembered, but those eyes, like still and steady, had not changed. Naomi stood up slow. "You were late." He smiled, soft and tired. 6 years late. "I know." Addie and Amos looked between them, confused. Naomi crossed her arms. "I thought you were dead." "I almost was." She did not ask more. She just looked at him and let the silence stretch the way it always had between them, not empty, but full of what was not being said. He glanced at the children. "Yours?" "No," her voice was quiet. "They were left behind." Merritt stepped farther in, crouched beside Amos, who blinked up at him. "You hungry, bud?" The boy nodded. Merritt reached into his saddlebag and handed him a wrapped piece of jerky. "There you go." Naomi watched him. He had always been like that, quiet hands, gentle voice. She remembered him helping her carry water when they were both 16, and she had not liked anyone looking at her back then. But Merritt never made her feel small. Never made her feel less. Now here he was, after all these years. She moved to the stove, stoked the fire back to life. "You passing through?" "No," he said. "I bought a parcel north of the ridge. Thought I'd come see the school. And I was hoping to find you still here." Naomi's hand stilled on the kettle. She did not look at him. "Why now?" "Because I finally can." She turned then. "And you think I am just waiting?" "No," he met her eyes. "But I was." She felt something warm and dangerous stir in her chest. She pushed it down. Addie tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Naomi, can we stay here?" Naomi knelt. "Just for a little while, all right?" "Until we figure something out." Merritt watched them. "I can help." She wanted to say no. She wanted to keep the walls up. But Addie's eyes were still too wide, and Amos was curled up beside the stove. She nodded once. Merritt rolled up his sleeves and started fixing the broken leg on one of the benches without being asked. Later, after the children had fallen asleep on the cot in the back room, Naomi stepped outside. The night was cool. Stars scattered like ash across the sky. Merritt stood beside the porch, arms folded, looking toward the hills. "You really bought land here?" she asked. He nodded. 50 acres. Needs fencing. Barn's falling in. But it is mine." She looked down at her hands. "You were always going to leave?" "Even back then. I had to. My father was dying. My brothers could not hold the ranch alone." She nodded. "And now? I came back. For good." Naomi studied him. "You did not write." I did not know what to say. I was young, and then too much time had passed. She looked away. "I was angry." "I do not blame you." They stood in silence again. A wind moved through the grass. Merritt turned to her. "Let me help, Naomi. With the children. With whatever else comes." She hesitated. "Why?" He stepped closer. "Because I never stopped thinking about you. And because I see a woman taking care of two lost souls like they were her own, and I want to be the kind of man who stands beside that. She swallowed hard, heart tight in her chest. I do not need saving. I know, he said. But maybe I do. She looked up at him then, the old ache in her chest twisting into something softer. They stood there, close but not touching, the night holding its breath around them. Inside, Amos stirred in his sleep. Naomi turned toward the door. We will need more blankets. Merritt followed her inside without a word. And though she did not say it aloud, part of her was glad he had come back. The next morning brought a hush of fog over the grasslands, low and silver-like breath held too long. Naomi stood by the pump, working the handle in slow rhythm, the cold water biting at her knuckles. Behind her, the schoolhouse was quiet. Addie and Amos were still asleep, curled together beneath the quilts Merritt had brought in from his wagon. She carried the bucket inside, set it by the stove, and began slicing dried apples into the pot. Merritt was already up, seated at the long table with his sleeves rolled and a pencil tucked behind his ear. A folded sheet of newsprint lay before him, half-marked in blue ink. You write for a paper? She asked, not turning from the stove. No, he said. I own one. She glanced over her shoulder. Since when? 2 winters ago. Helena. Naomi stirred the pot. The apples softened in the heat, scent rising. I thought you bought land north of here. I did. But the paper's still mine. I leave the day to day to a man I trust. I wanted something quieter for myself. She ladled hot water into the basin and set it beside the table. You don't strike me as someone fit for quiet. He smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. I used to think words were just what you said when you didn't have a rifle close by. Turns out, they carry farther. Naomi sat across from him, folding her hands. You're not the man I knew. I hope not, he said. The man you knew was still running. She didn't answer. Instead, she watched him uncap his ink bottle and begin scratching notes across the margin of the paper. His handwriting was precise. Not the kind taught in frontier schools, but the kind shaped by study. She leaned forward. You edit your own articles? Every last one. I had to teach myself typesetting too. Couldn't afford a compositor starting out. Naomi traced a knot in the wood of the table. I sent letters once. To a newspaper back east. Submissions for publication. He looked up. Did they print them? No. They sent them back unopened. Said I ought to try housekeeping instead. His jaw shifted. What were they about? Education. Girls not being taught past recitation and hymns. I thought someone ought to care. I do. She didn't meet his eyes. You're not the first man to say that. That may be, he said, but I might be the first one who means it. A small shuffle came from the back room. Naomi stood and crossed the floor. Amos peeked around the doorway, hair tousled, thumb in his mouth. She knelt and opened her arms without a word. He walked into them and leaned against her shoulder. Merritt rose and poured a mug of water, offering it to the boy. Amos took it carefully in both hands. We'll need to speak to the sheriff, Merritt said. About the children. Naomi nodded. I don't want them sent off. We'll find a way. She looked up. You don't know that. No, he said. But I want to. Later that day, Merritt hitched his horse and rode into town. Naomi stayed behind with Addie and Amos, guiding them through the numbers on her slate, though she doubted either heard a word. When the sun was high, she laid a blanket beneath the cottonwood and watched the children play with pine cones and twigs, turning them to kings and ships. She sat with a needle in hand, mending the hem of a worn skirt. Her thoughts wandered to the letters she'd written years ago, carefully folded and sent with hope. She had not told anyone, not even her sister back in Missouri. She tried to make a life as someone's wife once, a man from Idaho Territory who'd answered an advert for a mail-order bride. When she'd arrived, he'd taken one look at the books she carried and told her she'd be better off in a library than a home. She'd returned the next day on a freight wagon, her pride cracked but not broken. Addie ran to her with a handful of dandelions. Miss Naomi, can we plant these? They don't grow from their tops, sweetheart, Naomi said gently. But we can press them in a book. The girl nodded solemnly. Naomi reached for the worn volume of poetry on the porch rail and slipped the flowers inside. By dusk, Merritt returned with dust on his boots and a lined look about his eyes. The sheriff's asking questions, he said. But no one's reported them missing. No one's come asking. Naomi's fingers tightened around the book in her lap. Then they were left on purpose. He crouched beside her. I've got a thought. If you'd hear it. I'm listening. Let me file for guardianship. I've the standing, the land, and a name in Helena. It'd give them protection while we sort through the rest. Naomi's breath caught. And you think that will fix things? No. But it might keep them from being shipped to Missoula in a rail car. She looked at the children, asleep again on the cot. You'd take that on? I already have. She didn't answer right away. But when she stood, she nodded once. He didn't thank her. He just said he'd ride back to town first light. That night, Naomi didn't sleep. She sat by the hearth, wool in her lap, candle burning low. The wind passed over the prairie like a memory. She thought of the man who'd told her she was too clever, too opinionated, too much. And of the one sleeping in his wagon outside who'd seen all that and offered more. She lit another candle and began to write. Not a letter. Not a plea. But an article. And for the first time in years, she wasn't writing for permission. She was writing to be heard. By the third week of August, the cottonwoods had begun to yellow at their edges and the mornings came with a sharpness that whispered of early frost. Naomi stood in the corner of the schoolhouse, her hands powdered in flour, pressing dough flat on a broad wooden board. The stove crackled behind her. The scent of lard and firewood steady in the air. Addie sat on the floor with a book opened wide across her knees, sounding out syllables under her breath. Amos had fallen asleep beside the hearth. A small wooden horse clutched in his hand. Merritt stepped through the door with a stack of folded papers under one arm and a canvas parcel in the other. His eyes went to the children first, then to the basin where Naomi had set the rising biscuits. I brought you something, he said, setting the parcel down on the table. Naomi wiped her hands on her apron and untied the strings. Inside lay a bound sheaf, thick and stitched at the spine. The title across the front read, Essays on Women's Education in the American West. I had a printer bind them, Merritt said, watching her closely. Your articles. The ones you thought were never read. Naomi touched the edge of the cover. You kept them. They were never meant to be forgotten. She turned a page slowly. Her handwriting stared back at her, crisp and certain. A piece of her sheet given up. I thought they were gone, she said. They were never gone, Merritt answered. Just waiting for someone to see their worth. Naomi closed the book gently. What do you plan to do with it? I want to publish them, he said. Serial format, under your name. Not initials. Not a man's byline. She looked up at him, her voice low. You think anyone will read a woman writing about education? I think they'll read the truth when it's written this well. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she folded the edge of her apron and said, You sure I won't embarrass your fine reputation? Merritt leaned his weight against the doorframe, arms crossed. You'd strengthen it. Outside, a wagon creaked past on the road, the driver whistling through his teeth. Naomi moved to the stove and slid the biscuits in. The heat flushed her cheeks, though it wasn't just the fire. Sheriff came by yesterday, she said. Asked if we'd had any word from the children's people. Merritt's brow drew. And nothing. No one's claimed them. He said we could petition the territory court, but it'll take time. And money. I'll cover it, Merritt said. I already started the paperwork. Naomi turned, drying her hands. You didn't ask me. I didn't think I needed to. She held his gaze. You still don't. He stepped forward then, slower than necessary, until he stood just before her. The fire popped behind them. I don't want to take over, he said. I want to stand beside you. Naomi drew a breath. You always say the right thing. Not always, he said. But I've been wrong enough times to know when something's worth saying true. She reached up, touched the edge of his shirt sleeve where the stitching had come loose. You need a needle and thread. You offering? I might. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded letter. I brought this too. From my sister. She runs a reading room in Butte. Says she's been looking for someone to lead classes for girls. Thought of you. Naomi unfolded it slowly, eyes skimming the neat cursive. I'm not leaving here, she said. I know. I told her you wouldn't. But I thought maybe you'd want to write her. Exchange ideas. You've got more to share than this place allows. I've got a school, she said, and 2 children who need feeding. I'm not asking you to go, Merritt said. I'm asking you to be heard. She folded the letter again, slow and precise. You think I'm meant for more than this? I think you already are. Addie looked up then, her voice small. Miss Naomi, can Merritt stay for supper? Naomi turned, the corners of her mouth softening. That depends if he can be trusted not to burn the beans. Merritt held up both hands. I promise nothing but good intentions. Amos stirred, half awake, and Naomi crossed the room to lift him gently. She settled him in the rocking chair and tucked a blanket around his shoulders. Do you ever miss the city? She asked, not looking back. Sometimes. The noise. The ink smell. But I don't miss the men who talk over every woman in the room. Naomi met his eyes. You never did that. I listened, Merritt said, because you always said something worth hearing. She studied him a moment longer, then turned back to the stove. You'll need to set the table. He moved without hesitation, pulling dishes from the high shelf, his coat slung over the back of a chair. Naomi reached for the pot of beans, and the quiet between them felt easy for the first time. Night settled outside the windows, long and blue. Inside, 4 plates were laid. A place for each of them. And just before she ladled the stew, Naomi touched the bound essays again, her fingers resting on her name printed clean across the cover. No initials. No borrowed voice. Just her own, finally taking up space. By early September, Merritt had finished rebuilding the fence that separated the schoolhouse yard from the wide stretch of open prairie. Naomi stood under the lean-to, watching as he adjusted the last post with a mallet, his shirt damp at the collar and his hands streaked with earth. Addie was nearby, chalking letters onto the slate hung on the wooden wall, while Amos poked holes in the dirt with a stick, quiet and absorbed. Naomi walked to the edge of the yard, arms wrapped around a ledger. That'll hold through winter? Merritt leaned against the post, catching his breath. It'll hold. Might not be pretty, but it's solid. You always settle for not pretty? He looked over at her. Not when there's better standing in front of me. She didn't answer, only shifted the ledger against her hip. I've been offered a stipend from the territorial board. Enough to expand the curriculum, add arithmetic beyond sums and fractions. He wiped his hands on a cloth. That's no small thing. They want me to prepare a report. Evaluation of methods, term goals, student progress. I've never written one. You've written harder things. She looked at him then, the sun catching the edge of her face. It's different when someone's asking. Then write like they're not, he said. Write like you're telling them what they ought to already know. She opened the ledger. I thought about using Addie's work as an example. She's changed since she came here. They both have. He stepped closer, his voice lower. And so have you. Naomi didn't move, but her grip on the ledger eased. I've been thinking about the land you bought. What about it? If the children stay, we'll need more room. They're growing. And I've no extra beds. I've got a second cabin on the far end, he said. Dusty, but standing. I could clean it. I'll help. She turned the page in her ledger, eyes steady. I'm not asking to move in. I know. But I'd like to use the space for lessons. Maybe evening classes. He nodded once. It's yours. Addie called out from under the eaves, Miss Naomi. I finished my copy line. Naomi raised her voice just enough to carry. Bring it here and let's see. Addie ran across the yard, slate in hand, her shoes scuffing the dry grass. Naomi reviewed the letters with care, tracing her finger along the line. Well done, she said. The G needs less tail, but your spacing's near perfect. The girl lit up and Naomi handed her a fresh slate. Once Addie had returned to her work, Merritt lowered his voice. You ever think about what you'd do if you hadn't come here? Naomi let the question settle. I'd probably still be in Missouri, teaching boys who'd rather pull braids than read. Or married to some man who'd tell me to mind the stove and keep my opinions quiet. I'm glad you're not. I don't regret coming, even when it was hard. What about now? She closed the ledger. It's still hard, but it's not lonely. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. The court-approved temporary guardianship. Her eyes flicked to the paper. So it's real as ink and seal. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. They'll need to know when they're older. They'll know. Naomi looked back toward the children. Amos had begun stacking stones. Addie hummed softly as she wrote. I never planned on raising someone else's children, she said. Neither did I. But I'm not sorry. Me neither. The wind picked up across the dry grass and Merritt stepped beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I've got someone coming next week, he said. A woman from Helena. She runs a lending library. Wants to see the school. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You telling me I've got company coming? I thought you'd want to meet her. She's looking for someone to write reviews of frontier texts. Said she's tired of men writing about books they don't read. Naomi's lips curved, but not into a smile. That's a rare opportunity. You'd be right for it. I'll think on it. Merritt tilted his head. That's all I ask. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the prairie. Naomi turned toward the schoolhouse. I should start supper. I'll bring wood in. They moved together without speaking, the rhythm of shared labor falling into place like it had been there all along. Inside, while Naomi stirred beans and sliced the last of the summer onions, Merritt stacked kindling by the hearth. Addie helped set the table, pausing now and then to peek at the court paper Naomi had pinned to the wall. Later, when the children had drifted into sleep and the fire had burned low, Merritt stood by the door, coat in hand. He looked at Naomi, his voice quiet. You ever think about what comes next? She folded a cloth over the leftover loaf. I have. His hand rested on the doorframe. I won't push. But you'll wait. I already have. She nodded once. Then don't go far. I won't. He stepped out into the night, the door closing soft behind him. And for the first time in years, Naomi didn't feel like something was missing. She felt like something had just begun. The first snow came early that year, falling in slow, deliberate drifts that softened the sharp edges of the prairie. Naomi watched from the schoolhouse window, her breath clouding the glass. Amos was curled on the floor with a wool blanket and a carved set of letters Merritt had whittled, lining them up to spell names he couldn't yet read. Addie was at the table, copying from a book Naomi had borrowed from the Helena lending woman sent by post after their meeting last month. Naomi turned from the window and crossed to the stove, adjusting the iron kettle. The scent of steeping herbs filled the room. She'd picked them from the little plot behind the schoolhouse before the first frost, yarrow, wild mint, and the last of the chamomile. Merritt pushed open the door with his shoulder, arms full of splitwood, snow clinging to his boots. He shook it off at the threshold without needing to be told. I passed the magistrate's clerk on the ridge road, he said, setting the logs beside the stove. Said the final guardianship papers were signed. Should have the seal by tomorrow. Naomi didn't look up from the kettle. Then it's done. He stepped closer. You all right? She nodded once. I think I've been waiting for the moment to feel different. But it just feels quiet. He set a hand on the back of her chair. Quiet's not a bad beginning. Naomi poured the tea, slid a cup toward him. I've been offered a place on the district education committee. He blinked. That's not nothing. I said yes. He took the cup carefully. What made you decide? I realized I'm already doing the work. Might as well have a seat at the table where the decisions are made. Merritt leaned against the wall, watching her. You ever think about what's next for us? I do, she said. He waited. She didn't make him ask. I want to stay here. The school. The children. This place, it's mine now in a way it never was before. Merritt's voice was low. And me. Naomi met his eyes. You're not something separate from all that. You're part of it. He crossed the room, stopping close enough she could feel the warmth off his coat. Then let's stop circling it. She looked up at him, steady. You asking? I'm saying I want to build a life beside you. Not as a visitor. Not as a helper. As yours. Naomi didn't answer at first. She reached behind her, unpinned the paper from the wall, the guardianship document, now nearly worn at the corners from how many times she'd read it. She folded it once, then again, and set it inside the book of essays Merritt had given her. All right, she said. All right? She nodded. Let's build it. He kissed her then, not rushed, not uncertain. She leaned into it, her hands finding the edge of his coat, and for the first time in years, the weight she carried wasn't just hers anymore. That spring, they planted rows of beans and hardy greens behind the schoolhouse. Merritt built a proper fence around the garden and added a lean-to for firewood. Naomi taught classes in the mornings and held reading circles with the older girls on Saturdays. Merritt printed her essays in serialized pages at his press, and by midsummer, a woman in Missoula sent word asking to republish them in a broader journal. Addie grew taller, bolder. She asked questions no boy had ever dared ask in Naomi's classroom. Amos learned his letters and then their meanings and then how to read aloud without stumbling. They slept in the cabin Merritt had repaired, now sturdier, with a stove that never leaked smoke and a quilt Naomi stitched from scraps she'd saved over the years. On the first warm evening of June, Naomi stood barefoot in the doorway, her arms crossed lightly as she watched Merritt teach Amos how to hold a fishing rod. Addie sat by the creek with a book open on her lap, hair braided back with a length of ribbon Merritt had brought from Helena. He looked up and caught Naomi's eye. "You coming down here?" he called. She shook her head. "I like the view from here." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." He smiled, not the kind that asked for anything, but the kind that answered. Later, after the children had gone to sleep, Naomi sat with Merritt on the porch, her legs tucked beneath her, the night wind warm against her skin. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. "What's this?" he asked. "All of it. A home that's mine. A partner who listens. Children who run to me when they're scared. I thought I'd spend my life keeping the world at arm's length. And now," she reached for his hand, "now I want it close." They sat together until the stars deepened above them and the lantern burned low. And when the quiet came, it was not empty. It was full and warm and earned.